All right, so imagine like high stakes poker, right?
Yeah.
But the chips are like nuclear ambitions and oil pipelines, global influence, all that.
Tense and tense.
Yeah, that's the world we're diving into today. Iran and Russia, they've got this partnership brewing. It's fascinating. And kind of fraught, honestly.
Yeah, definitely complicated.
We've got this one article, really in depth, that lays it all out. We're going to cut through all the noise and figure out what this alliance really means. You know, for Iran, Russia, and for everybody else too.
The whole world's watching, basically.
Right, exactly. Okay, so first off, the article drops this like bombshell. There's this huge cooperation agreement that Iran and Russia are going to sign.
Oh, wow. When's that happening?
January 17th, 2025. And get this, it's not just like trade deals this time.
Okay, so what else? What's in it?
It's like the whole enchilada. Education, culture, everything.
Wow, the whole package.
It's like they're going steady after years of, well, let's just say, it's complicated.
Yeah, they've had their ups and downs for sure.
Totally. So what's really interesting to me is the timing of all of this.
Right, what now?
Exactly. Because both these countries, they're kind of butting heads with the West more and more these days.
Especially with the U.S.
Right, the U.S. especially. So this agreement, it feels like it's about more than just like, you know, shared interests.
It's strategic.
Totally. It's like they're teaming up.
Finding strengths in numbers.
Exactly. Like you mess with one of us, you mess with both of us. And they're not just talking, you know.
They're taking action.
Yeah. There's this thing, the North-South Transport Corridor. Ever heard of it?
Vaguely, yeah. Refresh my memory.
So it's this huge EE infrastructure project.
What kind of infrastructure?
We're talking railways, roads, waterways. And it stretches all the way from India to Russia.
And right through Iran?
Yep, smack dab in the middle. And the article mentions that there have been all these high-level Russian officials going to Tehran lately to hash out the details. So they're serious about this.
Oh, yeah, they're not messing around. This corridor is a big deal.
Huge. But why? What makes it so important?
Well, for starters, it's like a direct challenge to like Western economic dominance, you know?
Oh, interesting. So it's about more than just moving goods around.
Oh, way more. For Russia, think about it. It's a way to like project power, right?
Makes sense.
And to get around those pesky sanctions.
Yeah. And for Iran.
For Iran, it's an economic lifeline, like a way to actually survive all that pressure the West is putting on them.
Right. The sanctions are really feeling the squeeze.
Exactly. They're literally building a new way to do business without playing by the West's rules.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. Okay, so we're seeing all this economic cooperation.
Right.
But it's not just about money, is it? The article also talks about how they're working together in Syria, both backing the Assad regime. That's a whole other can of worms.
Sure. Yeah, that's a messy situation.
Super messy. But somehow they seem to be on the same page there.
Yeah, they've got each other's backs. What's the bigger picture, though? What do you think?
I don't know. That's what I'm hoping you can tell me. What is the bigger picture there?
Well, I think in Syria, you really can't ignore their shared interests. It's like where the rubber meets the road for this alliance. You know, they're both down there, boots on the ground, trying to shape the future of that whole region. And that binds them together more than any trade deal.
It's like trial by fire for their relationship. But let's be real for a second. There are some, like, speed bumps in this whole alliance thing, right?
For sure, some bumps in the road.
Yeah. I mean, the article talks about how they rely on each other economically, but they're also so different culturally. And then there's all that historical baggage.
Oh, yeah, tons of baggage.
So, like, is this alliance actually solid? Or is it just a fling? You know, a marriage of convenience that'll fall apart when things get tough?
That's the million-dollar question. I mean, historically, Russia has always kind of prioritized their relationship with the U.S. even when things are rocky.
It's like they're playing both sides.
Right, like keeping one foot in each camp. But for Iran, it's different. They see this conflict with the U.S. as like this never-ending saga.
An endless struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see how that could cause some friction.
Oh, yeah, big time. It's a fundamental difference in how they view the world.
And that difference, it can really mess things up. Like, remember that whole S-300 missile system thing?
Oh, right. What happened there again?
Russia promised Iran these super advanced anti-aircraft systems. And then when things with the U.S. got a little better, poof, they backed out of the deal.
It's like they left Iran at the altar.
Exactly. So after something like that, how can Iran really trust Russia to have their back?
It's a valid concern. For Russia, Iran's a valuable player, sure, but maybe not valuable enough to risk messing things up with the West.
So Iran's kind of stuck in this uncertain place,
Mm.
always wondering if Russia's going to stick around.
It's a pattern that keeps repeating throughout history. It's tough for Iran.
Definitely creates some trust issues. But, even with all that, the article does point out that Iran is the third largest importer of Russian arms. That's not nothing.
No, that's a pretty big deal. It shows how important this relationship is for Iran's security.
Right, they're getting something concrete out of this. But why all the weapons?
Well, think about it. Iran's facing all this pressure over their nuclear program.
Right, the whole world's on their case about that.
Plus, they've got all these rivals in the region. They feel surrounded, so they need firepower.
And Russia's the arms dealer. First, they're not doing it for free.
No, of course not. This is business. But for Iran, it's about survival. They're trying to protect themselves.
Right, it's a matter of national security. Okay, so let's back up for a sec. The article mentions this period, like between 2005 and 2010, where things got kind of frosty between them. What happened there?
Ah, yeah. They had a little falling out.
Like a lover's quarrel.
Sort of. The Obama administration was trying to hit the reset button with Russia.
That whole reset thing.
Right. Yeah. And Russia, they wanted to cooperate. So what did they do? They imposed sanctions on Iran.
They sided with the U.S. over their old pal. That's harsh.
Well, it was a strategic move.
No.
And Russia ended up getting some concessions from the U.S. in return. So it wasn't all bad for them.
Oh, so they played the field and got rewarded. Classic Russia.
Pretty much.
But then Putin comes back in 2012. Does that change things?
Oh, yeah. Big time.
How so?
Putin's return signals a shift. They start getting closer to Iran again. Russia even acts as a mediator during those Iran nuclear deal talks.
So they're back in the game, mending fences. And then Rouhani gets elected in Iran, and things really start heating up. The article even calls Iran a natural ally for Russia at this point. What shifted?
It wasn't just personalities, though, that probably played a role. You had the Arab Spring happening, all this upheaval in the Middle East. Both Russia and Iran saw the West sticking their noses in, and they didn't like it. So they found common ground in their opposition to that.
Shared anxieties, huh?
Absolutely. A common enemy brings people together.
And then in 2015, Putin goes to Tehran. They have this big meeting, and bam, strategic level partnership. Was that just for show, or was it the real deal?
Oh, it was more than just a photo op.
So what did it actually lead to?
Well, their economic ties skyrocketed after that, especially when the West slapped both of them with sanctions. They needed each other more than ever.
It's like suddenly they weren't just friends, they were family.
Exactly. Survival brought them closer.
And under Raisi, Iran signs all these contracts with Russian companies. Billions of dollars. So they're putting their money where their mouth is. But the article says that Iran doesn't always benefit equally from this, right?
Yeah, it's true. There's definitely a power imbalance.
So is this really a partnership, or is Iran getting the short end of the stick?
It's complicated. They need Russia more, that's for sure. But it's not necessarily exploitation. Think of it as a really high-stakes negotiation. Both sides are playing hardball, trying to get the best deal they can.
Okay, so maybe not a love story, but definitely a strategic partnership with some baggage. And speaking of baggage, we got to talk about the elephant in the room, Ukraine. Iran has been really careful not to say anything bad about Russia's invasion, even with everyone pressuring them.
It's a tough spot for them. They don't want to tick off Russia, who they rely on, but they also don't want to make things worse with the West.
So they're walking a tightrope, trying to stay neutral.
Exactly. They're even denying sending weapons to Russia, according to the article.
Yeah, I saw that. Trying to play both sides.
Trying to thread the needle. They're offering to be a mediator in the conflict, but that neutrality comes at a price.
What do you mean?
Well, now Ukraine considers them an enemy.
Ouch. Not good.
Nope. So Iran's playing a risky game with no guarantee it'll pay off.
So they're really in a tough spot.
Totally. But, this isn't the first time Russia and Iran have found themselves on the same side. The article talks about their history during the Cold War. Were they buddies back then, too? Well, not buddies exactly. More like they both felt like outsiders. Both had issues with the U.S. and its allies.
Misery loves company.
Kind of. They weren't exactly on the same page ideologically, but they had that shared opposition to Western dominance.
So even though the world's changed a lot, some things stay the same, like finding a friend when you feel like everyone's against you.
Exactly. And now, with China getting more powerful and the world order changing, it feels like those old instincts are kicking in again.
Like the gang's getting back together.
Yeah, something like that. The world's becoming multipolar. No one country is calling all the shots anymore. And both Russia and Iran, they see a chance to make their move.
to challenge the old rules.
Mhm.
And being in an alliance gives them more power.
Right. For sure. They've got a louder voice on the world stage when they work together.
Right. It's like they're combining their chips in this global poker game. But let's get real for a minute. What are they actually getting out of this? Beyond the big picture stuff, what are the concrete benefits for each country?
Well, for Iran, it's pretty straightforward. They need to survive.
Survive the sanctions?
Exactly. The sanctions are crippling their economy. They need access to markets, to technology, to weapons.
And Russia can provide all that.
They're a lifeline, helping Iran weather the storm.
Okay, so Russia's like the sugar daddy, keeping them afloat.
If you want to put it that way, sure.
But what about Russia? What's in it for them?
Well, Iran gives them a strategic foothold in a really important region.
The Middle East.
Right. It's a gateway to the Middle East. Plus, it's a market for their weapons and a partner in pushing back against the West.
So it's win-win, on paper anyway.
At least on paper.
But we've talked about the power imbalance. Iran needs Russia more. Does that mean they're getting a bad deal?
Not necessarily. It's more nuanced than that. They both know how the power dynamic works, and they're both playing their cards accordingly.
So Iran might be the weaker player, but they're not being taken advantage of.
Not exactly. They're tough negotiators. They know how to use their position to get what they want.
Like with the whole Ukraine situation, they're playing both sides, right?
Exactly. It's a dangerous game, but they're good at it.
So we've talked about the past, the present, but what about the future? Where do you see this relationship going?
Well, predicting the future is tricky, especially in international relations. But there are clues, like this new agreement they're signing. It suggests they're thinking long term.
So it's more than just a fling. They're getting serious.
It seems that way, but there are always things that could shake things up. The world is unpredictable.
So it's not a sure bet, but that's what makes it so interesting.
Absolutely. The world's constantly changing, and that makes it fascinating to try and understand. So keep asking questions, keep exploring. The world is full of surprises.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with one last thought to chew on. What if this alliance really takes off? What if Iran and Russia become the power couple of the world stage? What would that mean for the rest of us? It's a question worth thinking about.
It's a complex equation, you know. Iran really needs Russia, maybe more than Russia needs them, but I don't think they're being totally taken advantage of either.
So not quite exploitation, but definitely.
It's more like high-stakes negotiation.
Right, both sides trying to get the best deal.
Exactly.
Okay, so maybe not a love story, but definitely a strategic partnership with some baggage.
Yeah, for sure.
And speaking of baggage, we can't ignore the big one. Ukraine. Iran has been so careful not to condemn the invasion, even with all the pressure they're getting.
It's a really delicate balancing act for them. They can't afford to alienate Russia.
They need them too much.
Right, Russia's a lifeline for them right now. But they also don't want to provoke the West, you know? Especially the U.S.
Yeah, they're walking a tightrope.
Totally. They're trying to appear neutral, even though it's clear they're leaning towards Russia.
The article even quotes Iranian officials denying they're sending weapons to Russia.
Right, trying to have it both ways.
It's like, we're not taking sides, wink, wink.
Exactly, trying to thread that needle. They're even offering to be a mediator in the conflict.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, which is interesting. But trying to stay neutral has consequences too.
Like what?
Well, look at Ukraine. They basically consider Iran an enemy now.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's a risky strategy for Iran, and honestly, there's no guarantee it's going to work out for them.
It's a tough spot to be in. They're really caught in the middle.
No doubt.
So this whole Russia-Iran thing, it's a pretty complicated relationship. And you mentioned it goes way back. The article talks about their history during the Cold War. Were they tight back then too?
Well, maybe not tight, more like they kind of understood each other. You know, both countries had their own beef with the U.S. and its allies.
Like they bonded over their shared dislike of the West?
Yeah, something like that. It wasn't so much about shared ideology, but more like a shared feeling of being outsiders.
Okay, so a little bit of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing.
Exactly.
And it seems like that feeling's coming back now with China rising and the world order changing.
It's like history repeating itself. The world's not so simple anymore. It's not just the U.S. calling all the shots.
Right, we're in a multipolar world now.
Exactly. And both Russia and Iran, they see this as an opportunity, a chance to push back against the old way of doing things.
So they're teaming up to challenge the status quo.
You got it.
Makes sense. But let's get practical for a second. What are they actually getting out of this alliance? Like, what are the real concrete benefits?
Well, for Iran, it's about survival. Plain and simple.
Survival, you mean because of the sanctions?
Exactly. The sanctions are crippling them. They desperately need access to markets, technology, weapons, all the things the West is denying them.
And Russia can provide those things.
They're a lifeline.
Okay, so Russia's the supplier, Iran's the customer. But what's Russia's motivation here? They're not just being charitable, right?
Of course not. For Russia, Iran offers a strategic foothold in a really critical region.
The Middle East.
Right. It's a gateway to the Middle East, plus a market for their weapons and a partner in pushing back against Western influence.
So it's mutually beneficial, at least on the surface.
Yeah. On paper, it looks like a win-win.
But we keep coming back to this power imbalance. Iran seems a lot more dependent on Russia than vice versa. Does that mean they're getting a raw deal?
I wouldn't say that. It's not that simple. It's more about each side playing to their strengths. Iran might need Russia more, but they're not pushovers. They're shrewd negotiators.
They know how to leverage what they've got.
Exactly. And they're not afraid to use their position to get concessions, even from Russia, like we saw with their maneuvering around the Ukraine conflict. They're playing a dangerous game, but they're playing it well.
So we've talked about the past, the present. But what about the future? Where's this relationship headed?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Predicting the future is always a gamble. But this new agreement, it's a sign they're both in it for the long haul. They're trying to solidify the partnership.
So moving beyond the fling stage, more like moving in together.
Yeah, something like that. But of course, there are always external factors, unexpected events. The world's a volatile place.
Right, no guarantees. But that unpredictability is what makes it so fascinating to watch, right?
Totally. That's what keeps things interesting.
So we can't say for sure what the future holds for this alliance. But one thing's for sure, it's a relationship worth keeping an eye on.
Absolutely.
It has implications for the whole world. But the article we're looking at today, it focuses on the big picture, the geopolitical stuff. But I'm curious about the people living in these countries. How do they feel about all of this?
That's a great question, and an important one. Unfortunately, it's hard to say for sure. We don't have a ton of reliable data on public opinion in either country.
So we're kind of flying blind.
Not entirely. We can make some educated guesses based on what we know about social trends and the information that is available.
Okay, so what do you think? How do Iranians feel about this whole Russia alliance?
I imagine it's mixed. There's probably a sense of pragmatism mixed with some apprehension.
Pragmatism, because they need allies. Apprehension, because, well, Russia isn't exactly known for being a benevolent partner.
Right, exactly. They understand they need support, especially with the sanctions. But there's also a lot of historical baggage with Russia. Centuries of suspicion and mistrust. It's a tough balancing act for them, the need for support versus the fear of being dominated by a more powerful neighbor.
So maybe not a lot of love for Russia on the Iranian street. What about the other side? How do Russians feel about cozying up to Iran?
I'd say it's probably even more divided in Russia. You've got one segment that sees Iran as a valuable partner, a way to push back against the West. But then you've also got a lot of Islamophobia and prejudice against the Middle East in general.
Ah, so cultural differences could be a real obstacle.
Definitely. And then you've got the economic realities. Both countries are facing hard times, and that can breed resentment. People might blame their problems on the alliance.
The old us versus them mentality.
Exactly. When times are tough, people look for scapegoats. And that's why it's so important to consider the human element in all of this. These alliances are not just abstract ideas, they impact real people's lives.
It's easy to forget that when you're talking about geopolitics and strategy.
Yeah.
But it's people who have to live with the consequences.
Absolutely.
So how do we get a better grasp on that human side of the story if we only have this one article to go on?
Well, we need to go beyond the headlines. Seek out different perspectives. Find out what ordinary Iranians and Russians are thinking and feeling.
Like we need boots on the ground, not just satellites in the sky.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, international relations, it's about people. It's about the way humans interact and shape the world around them.
Well said. So we've talked about Iran and Russia, their history, their motivations, where things might be headed. But we've only looked at two players in this game.
And it's a big game. Lots of players.
Right. What about the other actors? How do they fit into this whole Iran-Russia equation?
Well, there's one player you can't ignore. The United States.
Right, the U.S. They've got a long and complicated history with both Iran and Russia. Sanctions, proxy wars, the whole nine yards.
It's a tangled web, for sure. And the interesting thing is, by putting pressure on both Iran and Russia, The U.S. might actually be pushing them closer together.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly. It's like their actions are having the opposite of their intended effect.
So the U.S. is playing a role here, even if they don't realize it.
They're a big part of the equation, whether they like it or not.
Okay, so the U.S. is like the antagonist in this story.
Yeah.
But it's not just them, right? The article also mentions China. And they've been making some pretty bold moves lately.
Mm-hmm.
How do they fit into all of this?
China's got a lot at stake here. They rely heavily on energy from the Middle East.
Right, oil and gas.
And they see both Iran and Russia as key partners in securing those resources.
So for China, it's all about keeping the energy flowing.
Stability is their top priority. And a strong Iran-Russia alliance helps maintain that stability.
But they're not just sitting back and watching this happen, are they?
Oh no, they're actively involved. They're investing billions in infrastructure projects, offering trade deals, strengthening ties. They're encouraging this alliance.
It's like they're building their own power block, a counterweight to the U.S. and its allies.
You could say that, and it has huge implications for the global balance of power.
Right, it's not just the U.S. calling the shots anymore.
It's a multipolar world. Multiple power centers are emerging. It's messy, unpredictable, but also full of possibilities.
Okay, so we've got the U.S. playing bad cop, China playing good cop. What about the European Union? Where do they stand in all of this?
The EU. They're kind of stuck in the middle. They want to keep doing business with Russia, especially for energy, but they're also committed to democracy and human rights.
Which puts them at odds with both Russia and Iran.
Exactly. They're trying to walk this tightrope between engagement and accountability.
Not an easy position to be in. And then the Ukraine war happened. That must have thrown a wrench in everything.
Oh, absolutely. Relations between the EU and Russia have really soured. They've imposed sanctions, condemned the invasion, but they're also still trying to keep lines of communication open, hoping for a diplomatic solution someday.
So playing the long game, trying to balance their principles with their interests. It's like a giant game of chess with everyone making strategic moves.
That's a perfect analogy. And all these players, all their actions and reactions, they all affect the relationship between Iran and Russia.
It's a complex web.
A very complex web.
So it's not enough to just look at Iran and Russia in isolation. We have to consider the whole global context.
It's all connected.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. But that's what makes international relations so fascinating. It's constantly evolving. There's always something new to learn and analyze.
Well, this deep dive into the Iran-Russia partnership has definitely been a learning experience. We've covered a lot of ground, their history, their motivations, the challenges they face, the role of other countries. But we've only scratched the surface, haven't we?
Oh, absolutely. There's always more to explore, but hopefully this has given you a better understanding of this complex relationship.
It definitely has. And it's made me even more curious about what the future holds for them.
The future is always uncertain. But that's what makes it so exciting. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep challenging your assumptions.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought. What if this alliance actually thrives? What if Iran and Russia become a dominant force on the world stage? What would that mean for everyone else? Something to think about.
It really is like a giant game of Risk. With all these different countries, like maneuvering for power, making alliances,
Right, everyone trying to come out on top.
Exactly. And you can't talk about this whole Iran-Russia thing without talking about the U.S.
Right, the U.S. They're a huge factor in all of this.
Huge. And it's interesting because, in a way, they might be pushing Iran and Russia closer together.
How so?
Well, the U.S. is putting all this pressure on both of them. Sanctions, military stuff.
Right. They're not exactly shy about flexing their muscles.
Exactly. And when you push two countries that hard, they tend to find common ground.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right. It's almost like the U.S. is creating the conditions for this alliance to thrive, even if they don't mean to.
So it's like unintended consequences of their actions.
Exactly. But it's not just a two-way street here.
Right. The article also mentions China. And they become a major player on the world stage.
Oh, yeah. China's definitely got skin in the game. They need energy, lots of it. And they see both Iran and Russia as key partners in getting that energy.
Right. Oil and gas. It's all about keeping the lights on, right?
For China, stability is everything. And they see this Iran-Russia alliance as a way to maintain that stability in a really important region.
The Middle East.
Right. It's where all the action is. So they're not just sitting on the sidelines watching this happen.
They're actively involved.
Yeah.
Investing, making deals.
Exactly. They're encouraging this whole thing, which makes sense from their perspective.
It's like they're forming their own power block. a counterweight to the U.S. and the West.
It's definitely a shift in the global balance of power. We're not in a unipolar world anymore. It's much more complicated and much more interesting, in my opinion.
I agree. So we've got the U.S. kind of playing the bad cop, China playing the good cop. What about the European Union? Where do they fit into this whole equation?
The EU's in a tricky spot. They want to maintain their economic ties with Russia, especially when it comes to energy.
Right. They're pretty dependent on Russian gas.
They are, but they're also committed to these values like democracy and human rights, which puts them at odds with both Russia and Iran.
Right. So they're trying to straddle that line.
Exactly. They want to engage, but they also want to hold these countries accountable for their actions. It's a tough balancing act.
And then you have the Ukraine war, which just throws everything into chaos.
Right. That's a major complicating factor. The EU has condemned the invasion, imposed sanctions, but they're also trying to keep a dialogue open with Russia.
Hoping for a peaceful resolution eventually.
Exactly. They're playing the long game. But yeah, the Ukraine conflict has definitely strained relations.
So we've got all these players, all with their own agendas and motivations, all influencing each other. It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. But that's what makes international relations so fascinating, right? This constant push and pull, all these competing interests.
It's like a giant game of chess, but with real-world consequences.
Exactly. And the stakes are high.
Well, this deep dive into the Iran-Russia relationship has definitely been a wild ride. We've explored their history, their motivations, the challenges they face, the role of other countries, and the potential consequences of their alliance. But, like with any deep dive, we've only scratched the surface.
That's true. There's always more to learn, more layers to uncover. But hopefully we've provided some food for thought, some new perspectives on this complex relationship.
I think we have.
Yes.
For me, it's raised even more questions, like where does this all go from here?
That's the question, isn't it? The future's always uncertain, and that's what keeps things interesting.
It's a reminder that the world is constantly changing, and we need to stay informed and engaged to understand those changes. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and be sure to tune in next time for another fascinating exploration of the forces shaping our world.